But when it comes to the hard drugs, they do drugs the least of any racial or ethnic group in the United States. But the ways that the laws are written is that they are incarcerated at a much higher rate. So how do we incarcerate more for doing drugs the least? That's that inequality that is built into the law, built into the system that we're talking about here. And that's what critical race theory is looking at, because it asks the question, for instance, Derek Bell, who was one of the key architects of critical race theory, asked the question, how is it that we could have the Brown decision, that landmark decision, Brown 1 and Brown 2, and still have schools more segregated than ever? How does that happen? And it happens through a series of laws coming in. So we had the laws that provided for shutting down the public school system, that then provided state-funded tuition for white children to go to all-white private academies, and there was nothing for black children. So like in Prince Edward County, Virginia, where they shut down the school system for 5 years. Imagine being in the 5th grade and your school system shuts down and it doesn't open up again until you're in the 10th. Imagine everything that you've lost. And by that time, then the laws that came into being dealt with providing opportunities for white parents to be able to have the choice to move their child out of that school if it was threatened with desegregation. So when you're asking about how do these laws work, that's how they work. They work through the criminal justice system. They don't have to say, let me back up. Even the Jim Crow laws dealing with voting, because of the 15th Amendment that says the state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So Mississippi, you know I was going to Mississippi, didn't you? So in the Mississippi Plan of 1890, they said, okay, we don't want black folks to vote, but we can't write a law like we used to write saying we don't want black folks to vote. So what are we going to do? We're going to use the legacies of slavery and make those legacies the access to the ballot box. And that way it looks like it's fine.
It's open to anybody who can read.
It's open to anybody who can read and anybody who can pay the poll tax. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't deal with the fact that you had African Americans who were killed because they dared to learn how to read. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't deal with the fact that you have unequal funding of black schools, so that, those schools were shutting down. They weren't even open for most of the school year, and most of them didn't go. Some of them didn't go beyond the 5th or 6th grade. And so to require then that they read a section of the Constitution, like they had a Harvard law degree, and then interpret it to the liking of the registrar. Mm-hmm. And so you get the Williams decision of 1898 that basically says the poll tax and the literacy test do not violate the 15th Amendment because everybody has to pay and everybody has to read. And so that way you can deny African Americans access by using the kinds of societally created characteristics for those people, for them, and use those characteristics as the access to the ballot box. And so that's what happened with the poll tax and the literacy test. And it's what we're dealing with now as we're looking at these battles over voting that also look race neutral on its surface, but looking at the characteristics of inequality that have been born over centuries of this nation's history.
Yeah, and I want to get to that. That's one of the questions that would be great to go to. But and I want you to chime in.
Yes.
Whenever. You brought up schools and you brought up desegregation and integration, and and there was a recent story about an Atlanta public school whose principal decided that in whatever grade level, and I tell you as an attorney, all of them are allegations until it's actually proven, but it seems to be that the principal thought it was a good idea to segregate classes on the basis of color. There were, I think, 2 black classes and 4 white classes. And I think it was a black parent who discovered that and was very taken back and thought, why would you do this? You know, and because she wanted her child moved to another teacher's room, she didn't know anything about it. And from what I understand, the administrator said it wouldn't work because she'd be by herself. She would not be, you know, because that's a white class. And it kind of took me back, if it's true, it took me back to like, you know, because my understanding is the principal that runs the school it is himself black. And I just trying to figure out how, would critical race theory condone that, endorse that in any way? Or would it, I mean, would there be some kind of a reasoning why it might benefit both? I can't see one, but I just thought I'd bring it up and ask. And
No, critical race theory wouldn't be able to engage with that. Critical race theory really is looking at the law and the way the law is shaped, and the way that the law constructs race and perpetuates racism. And it's a legal theory that is taught in law school. It's not taught in K through 12. So
Okay.
the way that it would look at that system, no, I don't see it.
I don't either. I just thought I'd ask. Maybe there was something I was missing, because it seems like you want integration. We want children to be integrated. We don't want, regardless of what is taught, and we might have differences on that, but we want children to be together. I mean, I can't see anybody who would want their children segregated. So, do you have anything?
Well, I wanted to ask, tell us about your background, about where you grew up, and.
Yes, I am very Midwest. My father was career military. Daddy served for 20 years in the Army, fought in World War II and in Korea. And when he got out, we moved to Columbus, Ohio, because he wanted my brother to go to the Ohio State University.
I gotcha.
And I ended up, where I got my sensibility from was watching my neighborhood turn into the hood. Watching how we had a neighborhood of honest, hard-working, God-fearing folk who were doing everything that they were supposed to do, and watching that neighborhood crumble despite them doing everything that they're supposed to do, and seeing my father fight tooth and nail for that community, fighting the city. When are you going to come pick up the trash? Basic municipal services that just weren't happening. When are you going to cut the grass on this city lot? It's overgrown. Rats are in there. When are you going to do your job? And seeing the pushback from there, the ways that community was then defined as pathological instead of honest, hardworking, God-fearing folk who are doing everything that they can in order to raise their kids, in order to keep their homes up, in order to have a safe neighborhood, and getting absolutely no support for that. So that's where my sense of justice comes in. And we always had books in the home. Daddy, we were the only family on the block that had the World Book Encyclopedia.
Yep. We had that too.
Right. And I was a voracious reader, right? Just going through and reading, A to Z always. And so the love of learning came through there. And also when I was in utero, my father was like, "You're going to college." So I knew I was going to college. In my elementary school was virtually all black. My junior high school was all black. My high school, I was bused, and they didn't want us there. And you could feel it, and it was the lack of support that happened in that space. When I said, I'm signing up for classes, I'm going to take the college prep track because Daddy told me I'm going to college. and my guidance counselor said, "No, you're going to make a great secretary." And I said, "No, I'm going to college." And she said, "No, you're going to make a great secretary." That's why I can take shorthand. But what I would do is I would check myself out of study hall and go sit in on those college prep classes, because I knew I was going to college. And then they figured out what I was doing and told me I couldn't do that anymore. And I said, why not? And they said, well, the school board won't allow it. I said, the school board won't allow me to get educated? Because I was that child.
Praise God you did.
Yeah.
Praise God.
Yeah, and I think about how many other of me ran into that buzzsaw, but didn't have the father behind them going, you're going to college. And I came out the womb hard-headed anyway.
We all are.
And so it was that really helped shape who I am, and also being raised in the church with a very strong sense of right and wrong, and knowing that what I'm looking at is wrong. Yeah.
Wow. Sounds like your dad was an awesome man.
Daddy was amazing.
Yeah.
Daddy was amazing.
That is awesome. I mean, he probably sacrificed a lot for his kids.
Ooh.
So.
Did he take you to the woodshed too?
Oh.
My dad
We both been to the
did. We both been to the
woodshed.
woodshed several times. Yeah.
Oh yes. That was really mommy's job.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's something. You know, when you're talking about schools and where you went to, and the high school that you're bused into, and you were really the minority there, and how you were treated. I would tell you that Coley and I got married when I was 19. She was 18. She just graduated. We were babies. Yep, we were. We went to college together. My parents believed we were both raised in the faith in Christian homes, and they were strong believers in the leave and cleave principle. So when they paid for my first year of college, but when we got married, we were on our own.
Oh, yep,
you are now, on your own. And but Coley went to actually two HBCUs in Nashville. Went to Tennessee State University and Meharry Medical College.
Wow.
And it was just the and I'll let her tell you about it, because the whole experience was. But I was married. We were married, and she would talk to me about it. And it was, other than maybe two instances where somebody had kind of, gotten upset that she was even there, which we figure every family's got somebody who is, for whatever reason. But I'll let her tell you about it. And,
TSU and Meharry had a joint dental hygiene program. Meharry has the dental program. And so most of our classes were at Tennessee State. We did travel to Meharry, and I mean, we got really close with our classmates. I had, most of my faculty were black, but I felt loved and embraced just like everybody else. And so, and they were quite frank with us, because during that time, TSU was in the middle of a kind of a bad area, and they told us, sometimes people walk through here and they're not part of the campus, so y'all always walk together when you go across campus. And at that time, Tennessee was doing a lot of reconstruction to make the campus, bring it up to par with like MTSU and the other universities. So I was there 2 years, and at first, it did feel awkward that I was a minority, but within a few weeks, it was so normal. It was so normal. And then there were two different occasions where we were walking across campus and somebody walked up to us with a group of guys and they're like, you don't belong here. And so we just kept on walking. I mean, I didn't know how to respond, because that was my school too.
And this is part of what has happened in this society, is the sense of where are you, who are you, and this battle that we have. Like, I'm teaching the civil rights movement this fall, so I heard you, and the role of these HBCUs in that movement, the role of Fisk in that movement. And that movement was an interracial movement. When you have a Jim Zwerg and a Jim Peck and blanking on her name. How can I blank on Loki's mother's name? Mulholland. Do not put that in the film. Joan Trumpauer. Yes, when you have that happening and you see the kind of backlash, so like during the Freedom Rides, when Joan's mother wrote down to the warden at Parchman, a prison where they had been put for daring to ride on the wrong side of the bus. And he was like, if you just knew how to raise your white daughter the way she was supposed to be raised, you wouldn't be having these problems. There is so much policing of place, of know your place, that happens in this society. Critical race theory does not go after that. Critical race theory is not about policing a place. Critical race theory is about helping us understand how we got to have a structure that is about place. That's what that does.
So in sharing that, is the goal of critical race theory to bring reconciliation?
Yeah, the goal of critical race theory is to help us understand how it came to be, how we came to have this stratification, how we came to have these hierarchies, and how they're embedded in the law so that we can get beyond this, so that we can get to a space where we can be. You know, and so the first thing is you've got to know what you're dealing with. It's that great question that you asked. It was like, you know, we had that incredible civil rights movement that got us to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So what does critical race theory do with that? And it helps us understand how the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act could only get us so far because of the stuff that was embedded in it and the stuff that was used to undermine it. So the way that it gets undermined, it's what leads to the Allen decision, where the Supreme Court says, look, this isn't only about the obvious mess you do, this is also about the subtle mess you do, trying to block folks from voting. We're going after the obvious and the subtle, because that subtle does damage. And so that's what critical race theory does. It's really looking at the structures built into the law that create these hierarchies about place.
That's interesting. So I guess I would ask, you know, on that, critical race theory, what you're saying is helps us understand. It's a legal construct. Mm-hmm. It's a theory that helps us understand how these things, how we've gotten where we are, mm-hmm. and where maybe we need to improve. Mm-hmm. And this, I guess, is maybe it's a little nuanced, I don't know. But would you say then that the theory as such, the legal theory, is not something that should be taught in schools, that theory, but the things that should be taught to help us reconcile and to understand our past and to learn from it should be taught in schools? Am I making sense?
Don't make me come over there and hug you.
Okay.
So yes, and so critical race theory is about the kind of legal concepts. So that's a law school thing. Mm-hmm. And so the debates really are about the histories mm-hmm. that are taught in our schools. So how do we understand why there was a civil war? And you had a whole lot of work being done by the United Daughters of the Confederacy early on, and then by a scholar named U.B. Phillips to say, oh, it wasn't about slavery. Slavery was a benevolent institution, and the slaves were happy because they were well taken care of. They were fed, they were clothed, they were loved. It was a good thing for black people. Slavery was a benevolent institution. This was about states' rights. That's what this war was about. And so when you get a narrative that teaches that, and that was a narrative that came up in the era of the lost cause. So it started getting generated shortly after the Civil War and really took hold during the rise of Jim Crow. and then just took its tentacles into public schools through the first half of the 20th century, teaching that slavery was a benevolent institution. It wasn't until scholars in the 60s and 70s were like, okay, so if slavery was so good, why'd they keep running away? You know, asking that question and getting into the archives, getting into the data that historians use, the letters, the memoirs, the laws, the books, the policy papers that they're all generating at that time to be able to ask and answer the questions. And so the battles that we're having now, so the red herring is critical race theory. But that's I'm like, if your baby is being taught critical race theory in kindergarten, your baby's in Mensa. So what we're really talking about is the history that helps us understand how we got here. That's where the battles really are, in what that history should look like. So in Texas, for instance, Texas bought a textbook that defined the enslaved as immigrant workers.
When was this? I mean, is this
like last year?
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So that when you have that kind of elision over slavery, which was so foundational to the U.S., in the ways that our laws work, in the ways that our politics works, in the ways that our economy worked, in the ways that this nation was built up. By the time that the Civil War happened, slavery accounted for about 80% of the nation's gross domestic product. I mean, whew, whew. And so to elide over that with, you know, they were just immigrant workers, means that then those students coming out of that school system don't have the knowledge to be able to understand what they're seeing.
You know, I was telling somebody the other day about this man named G.K. Chesterton. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was an English philosopher, author. He was a lay theologian. He, you know, his contemporaries were Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and those guys. But it was, I can't remember if it was the early 1900s, I think it was, but London, England was going through some very politically sharp times like we are today. And the London Times sends out this letter to all of these well-read authors, and it's asking them if they would please respond with what do they think is wrong with the world today. And I remember reading G.K. Chesterton's response. He decided to reply, and he took out a piece of paper and said, "Dear Times, comma," and he said, "I am," and then he just signed his name. And so I think sometimes people, and that's where I fall. I feel like if something is systemic, there's a tendency to say no one's to blame. It's systemic, and if I want to stop being part of the problem, then I slap a little. You know, whatever they call those things on social media around your profile picture to say, I support this or I support that. But what have we really done? What has that person really done to change the narrative or to correct their behavior? Because I think it's individual. I mean, I think we have to take individual responsibility. And so that's why when I see anything systemic, whether it's in the church or whether it's wherever it is, to me, it undercuts personal accountability, personal responsibility, or it has a tendency. People can do that, and then they can just feel like, oh, I've given money to this cause or that cause, so I'm not part of the problem. Does that make sense?
I see exactly what you're saying, and so I think part of what happens is that it's not one or the other, that we have to recognize the system that we're in that creates these hierarchies, that creates these inequalities. And then we also have to recognize the role of personal responsibility and making good choices. And that we don't abdicate responsibility on either one. Because those individual choices help sustain or disrupt and dismantle that systemic inequality. But but to say that the system, that our individual choices is just our individual choices, it means that we're not paying attention to what that long history has done in terms of conscribing or expanding the range of choices that we have to make. And so when we acknowledge what that long history has done in terms of then saying whether we can go from A to Z or A to B for our choices, that then gives us the kind of perspective to know how to intervene, how to see the world in a way that we can improve it, that we can enhance the quality of life for everyone.
Good, awesome. All right, well, you know, I did have one last thing.
Well, I was going to ask, you had mentioned several times that CRT is more in a university setting, and we're in Cherokee County. There's other, I mean, it's almost like a nationwide critical race theories coming to our elementary school. And so, what is that?
That is panic. That is fear. That is inaccurate. You will not have teachers teaching critical race theory in kindergarten. You won't have them teaching it in 8th grade. You won't have them teaching it in high school. It really is a legal theory that has, you know, they barely teach it in terms of undergraduate. It really is a law school thing. So what that is also dealing with, one of the triggers for this was the 1619 Project.
Okay,
Yes,
I've heard about that.
And I've got to tell you, I'm in it. I'm in the book that's coming out in November. And the 1619 Project says we have to look at the role of slavery in the United States, in shaping the United States. And the pushback to that was Donald Trump's 1776 commission that said we've got to have a patriotic history. You know, we've got to have a history that, you know, talks about how wonderful and how exceptional and how great the United States is. And that sounds great, but what it doesn't do is to take into account that this is a nation that had slavery. This is a nation that removed indigenous people off of the land. This is a nation that also said we hold these truths to be self-evident. And one of the things that I talk about consistently is that in this nation, our battles have been on that aspirational plane. That's where our battles have been. And if we don't take into account that we had these systemic inequalities from our founding, then we don't understand what these battles are and how incredible this democracy is. So think about this. The Civil War, when 80% of your GDP is tied up in slavery, and you go to war, and it ends slavery, wow. But we can't tell that tale if we're not telling the tale about the role of slavery in the United States, in shaping our politics, in shaping our economy, in shaping our vision of who is a citizen, who is not a citizen. And it's that aspirational plane, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that gives us a Martin Luther King fighting for democracy in the middle of the 20th century after the US has helped to defeat Nazis. And so there's this fear that talking about teaching slavery, teaching the removal of the indigenous people, that what that will do is that it will make our students feel ashamed. It will make our students feel embarrassed. Because when we're teaching that, we're also teaching about the strengths of the American people to fight for democracy. That the will, the resilience to fight, to imagine what real freedom looks like, and to really go for it. And so that battle that we're having is that battle over a patriotic history where we end up with these kind of cardboard figures of our founding fathers who saw everything just perfectly and did everything just perfectly. But no, these were human beings who made good choices and they made bad choices. And we've got to understand the ramifications of both of those to understand the richness of this nation. And so it is a battle over history that we're having here. And it's being called critical race theory because the word race is in there. And so that is like the chum in the water. That's like, whoo, no. And it's not that at all. It really is about the kinds of histories that are taught.
Yeah, I look back at history, like Egyptian history, where the pharaohs were, one pharaoh could just wipe out what another pharaoh did. It would just, they didn't want to, you know, it's like it didn't want. So I see, and now obviously slavery played a huge part in America. I mean, I don't see how someone can avoid saying that. And it actually, and while it is absolutely dreadful, it did give the opportunity for people to stand up and to, you know, call for justice and to call to those aspirational goals that are in those founding documents. And they are aspirational. They are, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to me, it is, that's aspirational. But when it was written and when it was ratified, it was not realized. And so we have to continue going on, because then you have Dred Scott. How can you say Dred Scott can comport with that? It can't. It was a beautiful, I mean, you know, one of the things I love doing, and I've been going back to it more and more, but, you know, Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract, you know, he starts that with that famous line, you know, man is born free and he is everywhere in chains. Sometimes those chains are, you don't see them, but they're still chains. So we have progressed. You know, we have Dred Scott was overruled eventually. Yes. You know, Brown versus Board of Education 1 and 2 took care of the separate but equal. We got a little closer to those aspirational goals, and Dr. King led the movement. We got close to those aspirational goals. It's just I see us getting so divided, and I hate it. I hate it that we can't have this kind of dialogue, because I mean I'm conservative. I am very conservative, but I believe so strongly in those rights that are given to us, not by our government, not by the state, but by God. And that means that actually everyone in the world has them, not just Americans. We just realize them. They were self-evident to the authors. So what I guess what you're talking about is that, just to try to see if I understand it right, critical race theory is not something being taught, wouldn't be taught. It's something that points out that we need to teach realistically what occurred in our history, the good and the bad, so that we know to learn from the good and model it, and to learn from the bad and stay away from it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So it is the way, for instance, that the Brown decision. Right, so after the Brown decision, Brown won, and then you get the Supreme Court with Brown 2 with all deliberate speed. And that was 55. In 56, we get the Southern Manifesto. That basically has over 100 members of Congress saying they will use all of their power to defy the U.S. Supreme Court. And you get these governors working together to figure out how to take down the Supreme Court decision, how to stall until the folks are so weary that they'll just give up and say, fine. And so we're seeing a process of political leaders saying they're coming after your children. You know, so we are here, this is Orville Faubus, for instance, in Little Rock, Arkansas. And he used the Brown decision as a political means, because he was going to be in a tough, tight election race, to say, I am here to protect your children. I'm keeping these kids out of our schools. And these were 9 honor students who wanted to go to Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. And he calls out the National Guard to keep them out of that school. And it became a political mechanism to gin up hate, to gin up dissent, when in fact Little Rock, prior to that time, had been what they called a moderate southern city, so that they didn't have any problems desegregating the buses like they had in Montgomery. It was like, oh, it's no big deal, okay, fine. And it was actually the school board that had worked out this integration plan and had it where the 9 students who were the honor students would be going to Central High. They had it all worked out, nobody was up in arms, and then you had political leadership coming in and seeing that there was gold in them their hills, and really stoked the flame. So much so that, you saw the National Guard come in, and then President Eisenhower calls Orville Faubus to the White House going, look, son. And Orville's like, yeah, okay. And then he goes back and he reneges on the deal. And Eisenhower, being a general, it's like, you gave me your word. And instead what you see is the same kind of violence that Faubus said was not going to happen. And so and that led then, because there was also in this international context, because the US, you cannot be the Jim Crow leader of the free world. The Soviets were having a field day with this, You're reading through Pravda, and they're talking about, look, they're trying to bayonet poor poor Negro children who are just trying to get an education. I mean, and so Eisenhower calls in the National Guard and has them escort these children through. Then you have Orville Faubus shut down the public school system in Little Rock after that year. And then the state provided funding for white children to go to all white private academies so that they could continue their education, and there was nothing for black children. So when we know this history, we see the ways that race and racism gets politicized, and how it can be deployed in order to meet an egotistical gain, a political gain. I want to be governor, and I'm in a tight race, and so I'm going to really, create this crisis that'll show my leadership ability. And so when we know this history, we know what we're looking at. We're like, it's apocryphal for Mark Twain when he said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure do rhyme. And so part of it is just seeing these rhymes, hearing these rhymes, the rhythms of the ways that it is deployed, and the way that saving the children becomes a mechanism that covers, that's the fig leaf for covering what is really a raw ascent to power.
Well, really, the kind of the last question I have, and you brought it up when you were talking about the Little Rock School, is that you had said it earlier, and then you just brought it up again. It reminded me, and I can't thank you enough for just agreeing to do this and answer our questions. And my dad, when we were being raised, I was kind of stubborn sometimes, and so he would tell me. He would, when he was trying to get a concept across to me and I just wasn't getting it, he'd say, okay, Bart, take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth. And I think that a lot of times today, what we have is people on all sides with cotton in their ears and running, their mouths and not really listening to each side. Because it's almost like like when we say we, it's like, I believe I know how they feel, so I'm going to attack what I believe they feel, instead of listening and asking, say, tell me, explain this to me. And I think that, maybe it's the cable news cycle, maybe it's our shorter attention spans, whatever it is, we've gotten away from productive dialogue. And so I was thinking about when you were talking about Little Rock, and the schools, you know, it is undeniable that we have kids, and mostly minority, that are in urban, blighted areas with schools that are failing. That just, I can't imagine being a parent and saying, I really have no choice. I mean, my child has to go to that school. I can't afford to send them to a private school. The school's failing them. The school's got failing grades. You know, they're passing them along. I just cannot understand. I could not, being that parent would just be so tough every day, every morning.
Yes, Lord.
And so, you know, I for one, and unless like I said, I listen to all information. We listen to information. We are not, you know, we would rather be catalysts than just, you know, we're never going to change. But what do you think about school voucher systems for places like that where the parents really have no choice? The kids aren't really allowed to reach their full potential, but they don't have the money to put their kids in any other school. I mean, for the alternatives of a charter school or something like that.
And I am a firm believer in public schools, public education. Vouchers have not proven to be the answer. When I was in Ohio, and you know, when I was in Ohio, the Cleveland Public Schools had a 27% graduation rate, and the mayor, the governor at the time, set up a voucher system for the Cleveland Public Schools. Except that where the bulk, there are like 80,000 students in that school system. There were only 5,000 vouchers available. And the bulk of those vouchers went to students who were already in private schools. And so the history, and so you also look at what happened in Detroit. Detroit schools, you know the long history of Detroit public schools from the Milliken decision. And so the Detroit public schools have been in trouble for years. And you had then basically a move to create a wave of charter schools in Detroit. And the result has been that they weren't any better in terms of educating the students. And so we have to ask ourselves, why? Why? There's something that we know what we need to do. Why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we putting the resources in our public school systems that our public schools need? Why aren't we putting the support structures around teachers so that they can fly with these students? Why aren't we doing that? And I think part of that is, I think part of it is the way that we ended up, when we talk about how did we get here, we ended up with a twin pincer motion in terms of Supreme Court decisions on Brown. One of those twin pincers was the Rodriguez decision, am I getting this right? Coming out of San Antonio right before the Milliken decision that dealt with the terms of equal funding. And so you had a school district, the Edgewood School District, I believe it was, the Edgewood neighborhood in San Antonio that was overwhelmingly Mexican and African American. And they were charging themselves at the highest rate possible by law in terms of property taxes, and were only able to generate something like $23 per head for students. And then you had, I forget the name of it, the other school district in San Antonio that was a predominantly white, affluent neighborhood that was not taxing themselves at the highest rate. And they were generating several $100s per student. And so the parents in the Edgewood district sued, and the Supreme Court ruled that equal funding is not necessary to have equality of schools. And so you take that decision, and then you take the Milliken decision, where they tried to deal with issues of racial balance in the Detroit public schools by incorporating the suburbs. And the Supreme Court ruled the suburbs didn't create this problem, they can't be part of the solution. You're going to have to figure out how to do integration all in Detroit itself. And so what that meant, when you're looking at taxing based on property values, and where property values have a long history of what happens with zoning laws. So when you have zoning laws that allow dumps to be put in place, when you allow, frankly, porn shops and carryouts and liquor stores, all of that depresses property value, right? And so when you have that happening, when you have these laws creating these things that depress property value, but then you're predicating the financing of public education based on those property values.
I can see, and that's the biggest thing for me. The inequality in educational opportunities is I mean, it upsets me. That is one thing that I would want to do everything I can to try to bring about, not in equity in the outcome, but in equal opportunity to education. And so, you know, on your point about the funding, I actually, you know, I pulled up the Georgia Department of Education numbers, and I looked at Fulton County schools and I looked at Cherokee County schools. I looked at the total budget, and they have to be posted. They have 3 years and for Cherokee. And then I looked at the total number of students. And you know, it appears that from what I just simple addition, I went to law school. So I'm not a mathematician, but
I play one on TV.
I'll play one on TV. But it appears that the Cherokee County Schools spends a little bit about $2,000 less per student as part of their overall educational budget. Would you break it down, because the Georgia Department of Education does this on their website, to the instructional budget, Cherokee County pays about $700 or $800 less per student than what is paid in Fulton County. So I look at it and I say, well, it's obviously not a funding issue. There's got to be another solution to giving these kids equal educational opportunities. I mean, you know, because I don't want to give somebody false hope. I want it to be real. I want them to say, look, it's like when we run a 100-yard dash and we run 100 yards and we don't say, well, you're in this area, so you only have to run 30 yards because you've got, that does that person no good. Right. And so I want to see them have the educational opportunity, but if they don't have it and the funding is basically equivalent, maybe even more, then I look at it and I say, what is the solution? And that's why the school voucher thing you said, 5,000 vouchers for these. I mean, it would be give them the amount that the school pays on their instructional budget to anyone who wants to come out of a failing school, a school that is not meeting the needs of those kids. So, and I don't know how you feel about that. I mean, I just did that quick research. It may,
Yeah, and I am not a fan of vouchers. And I do get the absolute, as I said, my father was like, you're going to college. And I'm a firm believer in quality education. And I just believe that so one of my colleagues here, Professor Vanessa Siddle Walker, amazing. She is an education professor. And she studied the ways that Black teachers taught Black children in the era of Jim Crow. And how they succeeded in doing so. That there are these models, and they're working on replicating these models of success, the ways that you empower students to learn, the ways that you draw upon their strengths, the ways that you see them in terms of their strengths and not in terms of their deficits. All of these elements just help create an environment that is rich with learning. To me, that is part of what we must be doing. And so when I talk about empowering teachers so that they can fly, that's what I mean.
Well, I could talk to you for hours. I really could. I know that Andy may not want us to. And I know eventually the school's going to need their library back. But I mean, I hope that it flips the narrative, because Coley and I have always been about reaching out to people with diverse and even adverse opinions, because that's the only way we grow, is if we're vulnerable enough to talk. And if your positions are not strong enough that can withstand questions and answers and productive dialogue and debate, then you have to question why you're holding them.
Preach.
So, yeah. Yes. So I'm all, yes. I really appreciate you spending the time. I mean, like I said, I honestly could go on and talk for hours with you and listen to what you say about, your thoughts, because it just listening it is not dangerous. But we all must come, I believe, principled understanding where, for me, faith is huge. So, I look at it, and I tell you what I love, and whether this makes it on the tape or not, I love the way that Tony Evans talks about people who don't think that races can come together. And he says it's like oil and water. He's like, you put oil and water in a bowl and you mix it up, and he's like, oil and water will never come together. He said, but I love sandwiches. And he says, I love mayonnaise on my sandwich. And he said, you know what you do? He said, if you'll take an egg and put it in with the oil and water and whip it up, it emulsifies the water and the oil. And guess what? They both come together and they make something brand new. And it tastes delicious. And he's like, and it doesn't mean that the water's any less water than what it was, or the oil's any less oil than what it was, but the egg brings them together. To me, my faith is that egg. It is bringing people together and reconciling. And I think that's the true way for us to really be reconciled. Nothing can be forced. It has to be. We're dealing with the heart issue. So that's, I appreciate all of your insights, and thank you for sharing with us.
And thank you so much for being here and asking these wonderful questions and engaging in this great conversation. Thank you. I love it.